tenders body and appointing a procurement legislator. And then you further watering down his authority by removing so many pieces of important issues that he would have had governance over. It is of great concern to us, and particularly the small and micro businesses throughout Trinidad. When we compete for any kind of contracts in the country, we want equitable distribution of it. And we want, first of all, to remove the input by any politician, if I may say that. Because the more you involve the politician in any procurement process, is the more likelihood of interference. And in my opinion, the safeguard must be that we deal with it in an equitable and a way that everybody will become comfortable and believe in the just and fairness of whatever you do in procuring these pieces of.
Based on your amendments that are outlined, do you think that the fairness and equity of the distribution of state contracts can be an issue with respect to this amendment?
With this amendment, it really brings into the fore that you have deep concerns, because one of the deepest concerns is your political affiliation and how you get contracts being affiliated. And if you have a government that is not equitable in the distribution, and you are removing quite a number of these services from the legislator, then that concern is paramount. And it is going to interfere with how people perceive what happens to them when they apply for some contract or apply to do something under the present scenario.
And Rishi, what I know that you are very involved with respect to FOIs and the Freedom of Information Act.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us, for example, some of the mechanisms that an ordinary person who really wants to get information on contracts, on services, anything that the government does, is there any mechanism that they can use in order to get this information?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because normally when you deal with procurement, the whole question becomes now of confidentiality in the process, confidentiality in terms of services and cost and stuff like that, because obviously you want to maintain some confidentiality as you go through the process, then show equitably. But then the question now becomes, once a contract has been awarded, what happens after that, and how do you know, or how do you assure that the process was equitable? I think that's where the Freedom of Information Act is a very powerful tool in the arsenal of any citizen in the country to be able to query, because the Act more or less gives you the right to access information from government only by limited exceptions and exemptions that you would not be able to get it. I think the Act has been used greatly by many people I know of, many contractors who were unsuccessful in the procurement process, to query the procurement process, to query how did they actually go through to award these contracts. And there are many court judgments that have gone before the courts, and where the courts have ruled in favor of contractors and directed public bodies to give out information, obviously redacting those things that may be confidential or maybe of a financial nature that could cause uncompetitiveness. But apart from those things, I've generally forced public bodies to give out information to say, let us demonstrate that the process was fair and accountable to everybody. So it is a very powerful tool that anyone can use to be able to force government to give information to ensure accountability and transparency.
You said that there are court judgments, and is there any particular example you could share with the listening public in terms of?
Yeah, there was a case involving NIPDEC. I don't remember the exact name of the case, but it goes back to 2008, 2009, in which a contractor was awarded. He was the initial contractor on the project, and then a public authority contracted NIPDEC for NIPDEC to do the procurement exercise. So the procurement exercise was done, tenders were sent out. Of course, the contractor submitted tenders because he was part of he initially delivered the service, and he wasn't awarded the contract. So he wanted to query it. So he did a Freedom of Information request, seeking to get information as to the process that went through, the scores, the price instruction, everything with regards to the process. The courts in obviously he was not given the information, so he went to court, as is your right under the Act. So if he did a judicial review action, went to court, and in the judgment of the court, the judge realized that yes, there are certain pieces of information that may be confidential or may have caused inequity if that information was to be given to the contractor. So the court ruled that the public authority had the obligation under the Act, and the Act does give this obligation to redact information, basically blanking out information that should not be seen because of confidentiality issues. But still, the public authority should also give out information regarding the procurement process. In your evaluation committee reports, taking out, of course, personal sensitive information, so that you can demonstrate to the contractor, in this instance, but generally to the public as a whole, that your procurement process was transparent and above board. So that's just one example of someone using the Act as a way to force a public body to show that the process was transparent and accountable.
Okay. And Jason, with respect to the amendments that we have all studied and we have all considered, as a businessman, how does inequity in terms of the distribution of state resources can affect small and micro businesses in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, it affects it in terms of scale, right? Because you have to understand that SMEs and larger corporations and companies don't play on the same field, right? There is economies of scales, right? So there is a difference in terms of how they'll be able to compete against each other. I think one of the things that boil down to understanding what we really have to focus on and have to deal with the equity issue on the regulation body itself, because we have to understand that people have to manage and interpret what the Act says and the laws, right? And if it is you don't have equity on these institutions itself, it could be from a gender standpoint, it could be from an ethnicity standpoint, it could be even from a political standpoint. Are we really being fair? Because most groups have a bias, right? And that's very evident. And if it is we don't get it right at the board level, at the managerial level, right, then the interpretation of all these things that we're proposing can still be flawed. That's my take on how equity really plays.
Okay. Yeah. All right. With respect to going forward now, in terms of we have to look at the reality in terms of COVID-19, government in terms of lending support to smaller businesses. Do you think that there should be some level of policy where government should encourage smaller businesses to also participate in the tendering processes, so that they can also have what we will call a piece of the pie, so that they can survive as a small business and at the same time create levels of employment for thousands of persons who have lost their jobs due to COVID?
Well, the government is probably the largest employer of people in the country,
Yeah.
right? But similarly, the government, in terms of the revenues that it generates for SMEs by extension, right, it is very critical. And we have to understand that in this economic time with COVID, right, there are additional pressures that SMEs have to deal with, right? One, getting access to foreign exchange. Two, just getting financing on a whole, even in light of high operational costs, having to prepare and put things in place to fight and protect their stakeholders against COVID, right? It's very tough, and they're also dealing in a position with less private business, right? Because everybody has less money. One of the avenues that we can keep them afloat is to make sure that we're being fair to the SMEs, to give them the opportunities to do business with government institutions. So this act, in terms of giving priority to those SMEs, it has to be considered. because in the scheme of things, government business is a very significant part to the survival of any company in the country, right?
Ms. Ali, you have any views on what Mr. Roach would
Well,
say?
I agree with Mr.
business.
Roach and his analysis on the whole thing. It is so important in a country and an economy like what we have here now, and the impact that even before COVID, you had the country going into a mini recession, and then you had COVID bringing it down, crashing. And if you want small and micro economies to survive in this state, then you have to find innovative ways to really approach those small and micro and allowing them to take part in whatever the government has to offer. And if you don't include them in any pieces of legislation and include them in a way that it could be meaningful and give them protection as well, then you're really defeating the purpose of keeping this economy alive. So it is important, it is vital at this point that our economy has significant amount of input and impact coming from government. And this piece of legislation that has been, well, not proclaimed, but this piece of legislation is going to impact very, very hard on small and micro economies.
Rishi, there's one particular amendment that I think that I want to get your perspective on. It deals with the exemption from oversight for debt financing services for the national budget. We know government raise revenue through taxation. We could raise revenue through borrowings, and also we have the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to also supplement government budget. What are your views on creating an exemption when it comes to lending, government borrowing?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point you raised there. It's very interesting that government would want to take that approach. Obviously, we know our debt to GDP ratio right now has exponentially risen over the last. It was steadily rising over the last couple of years, and I think with the onset of COVID, it really went up above a notch. Obviously, because of government had to things shut down and government had to find ways to get revenue and get monies. But there still needs to be that. For me, it always boils down to accountability and transparency. In that, obviously, with government bringing on debt, the question always becomes, how are you going to repay the debt? The debt has to be repaid one way or the other, and there are different avenues. Obviously, if you have to repay debt, one of which, if you're not generating enough revenue to be able to pay it, would be to find other ways to raise additional revenue, which is through taxation.
Exactly.
And taxation could come at different levels, from a business perspective, from a personal income perspective. So I think, in terms of the approach taken, it comes back to the question of transparency and accountability. Why would you want to remove oversight from, in terms of transparency, in terms of the way you're going to procure your debt servicing arrangement? And again, if you're going to use the banter of, these types of things are done, in confidentiality and stuff like that to allow for negotiations to take place, then what other alternative mechanisms are you allowing for people to be more open and transparent to the population? You're taking away one avenue that was there within the law, but you haven't proposed, I haven't heard of any proposed other avenues that you can allow to have transparency in the process, apart from obviously coming and reporting to Parliament, the opposition doing their role and questioning, people asking questions, and of course filing freedom of information requests and whatever it may be. But there still needs to be some, but there are two types of disclosure as far as I'm concerned: reactive and proactive. And those types of approaches are more reactive, in that you're forcing government to come to be open, whereas I think government should always be proactive in terms of the transparency and the process that's taking place in terms of these things. So I find it curious, and no alternative being offered.
And well, it ties into another amendment, which is, so we created an exemption for borrowing when government takes loans. So no oversight over that. And then it ties into accounting and auditing services. So you also create an exemption from who you borrow from, and now there's now an exemption of how that money would have also been spent.
Yeah,
because there's no oversight on who you contract to do auditing services for the state. Each ministry will have their internal
audits,
but then you have to have an independent audit. What are your views on that tying together with the lending?
Well, I think in not only that particular part, but some of the listing of services that were exempted from the, when I mean exempted from application of the Act, I mean exempted from the other procedures as far as I am aware. So, the Act talks about challenge proceedings. So if people are unsuccessful, they have the ability to make a challenge to the procurement process, and that goes to the tribunal that was established under one of the amendments, I think, to the Act. But now by removing these services like legal, auditing and stuff from the Act, it also removes the ability of people who may have tendered for the process to challenge the proceedings, to allow for equity and transparency in the process. So again, it raises the question, if you're removing it in one end, because of whatever reasons you may have and the government may have, the question is now, what other systems or what other tools are there for people to be able to query it or to force government to be proactive? Because anybody could make requests, anybody could ask questions. But I think we should move away from a reactive approach to getting government to tell us what's going on, to government being more proactive and open up front.
Jason, what are some of the, you mentioned that there are issues you think that could happen from the oversight authority itself, in terms of whether or not they are completing their job with equity and due diligence. And then that will trickle down into the entire procurement process in terms of how government hires. What are some of the recommendations that you may submit as a businessman to, while at the same time looking at the government need to award contracts, value for money, and also ensuring that there is transparency and accountability in the system?
Well, I think the general idea of decentralizing some aspects of procurement to state agencies is the correct direction. It's just getting it right on the people side, the management side, and in terms of whatever strategy an organization may or a state entity may choose to take. Some people might take a hard cost strategy where it's just basically competing on who has the lowest price, or whether it is they choose to adopt a strategy, as you would have mentioned, value for money, where they will take other things into consideration, your ability to deliver good service, your ability to deliver quality products. It becomes more subjective at that point. And this is why the human element of it is very critical. For me, I know in terms of writing legislation, it's very difficult to manage people through that. It really can't. So it really boils down to interpretation. But I think a little more has to be done to take that into consideration, right? Because at the end of the day, the value that the SMEs and the small business people are going to get is to ensure that they are not being out-muscled, because if it is you're going to evaluate contracts on all these fancy things in terms of how much capital, how much resources you have access to, and all these different things that smaller enterprises cannot compete with, right? We have to look at more subjective elements in the procurement process to ensure that we're being fair.
Mr. Ali, there's one area that also there was a very late amendment in the Senate where there's an exemption to matters relating to national security. I know that you are also a player in that field in terms of being a justice of the peace, and you have your statutory role to play in the criminal justice system. I just want to ask you, what do you agree with this particular amendment, particularly with exempting matters of national security? The reason I say this is that when someone hears national security, automatically you think surveillance equipment, you think sensitive equipment belonging to the state for whatever purpose. But this can also include vehicles, the procurement of goods and services for various ministries, So the way it's drafted, my interpretation is that there's probably this blanket exemption for anything both under national security, which can in fact be a little dangerous because then you could procure regular goods and services and say, well, this falls under national security. What?
I really have a serious concern with that in particular, and I'll tell you why. When I look at national security and see how many bodies come under national security, you have the prisons, you have the fire, you have police, and you have so many others where goods and services are so essential to deliver to those agencies. And when you exclude them from that piece of legislation, what you're really saying is that you have full control of who delivers and who are qualified to give that delivery to those institutions. And to me, the inequitable distribution of any service is what could be brought into contention. I believe that the equitable distribution of those things should have been addressed more, not just a blanket statement that will exempt national security, and so many others that they have exempted. Because if you look at other areas like law, if you look at other areas where services can be done by the smaller people, and in this climate, we're looking at the small people who don't have the wherewithal to really achieve what they ought to achieve from government contracts. And if you're going to eliminate them, by just one swipe, by taking out an entire ministry, then really the justifiable situation there does not come into play. So I have a serious problem with it. It's really not coinciding with the equitable part of what the country deserves.
My interpretation would have been the definition. Are they referring to if the item is a matter of national security, or is it national security?
Matters of national security.
Matters of national security. I mean, I don't know what is a matter of national security and what matters of national security should differ from normal matters. So
if it is not properly defined.
If it is not properly defined. And I think that is where the problem lies to me, because I could understand if something is a matter of national security, probably you have some strategic plan to reduce crime that you don't want to make public, so you have certain equipment to procure. I can understand issues like that, that you would need to leave things off the table. Yes. But I think because it hasn't been defined clearly, right, there is some ambiguity there that could be cause of concern.
I think one of the major things we've had with the Procurement Act since the Act has been passed is the absence of regulations. Because as far as I remember, the procurement regulator would have done extensive stakeholder consultations between 2015 when the office was established with members of ministries, departments, civil society organizations, which actually participated in the civil society organization consultation, gotten wide range of views. And as far as I remember, draft regulations were submitted to the Minister of Finance as far as what the regulator told us. And the regulations are really what I would say are laws are like, flesh, like the skeletal frame.
Yes.
But the regulations are like the blood that flows through and everything that lets you interpret, to his point, what do we mean by national security and these things. So I think that's a key part that has been missing also in all of this also, in terms of, as far as we know, the regulator would have submitted his regulations to the Ministry of Finance a couple of years ago, as far as I remember, for, consideration, review, and then to be submitted to Parliament. So that is also, I think, the missing part that we're missing, where the regulations and all of this.
And the Minister of Finance did allude to that fact that the Act will not be fully proclaimed until the regulations are approved.
Right.
I know the regulations have also gone under for legal scrutiny by senior counsel, and there's no issue with that, in particular because you want to ensure that whatever regulations are brought really gives life to the Parent Act, which is to promote accountability transparency. My issue is with the length of delay,
Yeah.
because it's been since 2015 that this act has been passed. We're now in 2021, and we can't get this thing up and running. And I remember Jason was making the point also with bureaucracy. Why things take so long to get done in Trinidad and Tobago, especially in the public service. So there must be some level of expediency when it comes to these types of matters. And just going back to the point of national security also, is that it's so critical in terms of the national security apparatus having regard to our current situation. I mean, businesses complain of the crime situation. The ordinary citizen complain about the crime situation. So it's really to ensure that we can procure these goods and services expediently, good, proper working equipment, but at the same time, we must be transparent in how we procure these goods and services. And especially in these COVID times when government revenue has significantly reduced, you want to ensure that you get your value for money. And Rishi, I don't know if you would have seen, there's an article in the United Kingdom, I think by Barnes Hale, who spoke of the need for transparency and accountability, especially during COVID.
It is, yeah. And I think the one issue the UK had recently was this whole track and trace app that the government would have tried to implement, and billions of dollars that were being spent, and the lack of transparency in that. So yeah, especially, I mean, during COVID, it's unique. I think it's the first time in almost a century the world is facing something like this. So obviously governments have been had to act quicker than normally would have done, probably shortcut certain things to get, resources or to get care to people that they need. And that's perfectly fair and perfectly fine. But then after the dust has settled, there needs to be that level of, I think the Barnes would have alluded in the article in the UK, the whole idea of, at the end of the day, you're playing with public funds. And again, there's a public interest element that comes into it, in that, you have to act in the interest of the public, and there needs to be, yes, we know leeway would have been given because of circumstances. That's just how it is. Every country went through that. But now, as we begin to get some kind of normalcy coming back, there now needs to be, accountability into, what went on, what happened. And not saying mistakes may be made, and mistakes it's good to make mistakes, because through mistakes you learn. And I think, again, and these are lessons I think, and that's a problem we have in our society, having worked also in government for like over 15 years myself at several senior levels and being on state boards, is that we don't like to learn from mistakes or admit that we've made mistakes, and mistakes help us learn. I think, in regards to the Public Procurement Act, I think it's also symptomatic of our nature and the bureaucracy of always trying to be perfect in everything. But no law, you would know as a lawyer, no law is perfect. A law is always subject to change because society is dynamic. So it's about learning and putting what you have best at present now and letting it work, and then from there learning. I think that's the reason why the procurement regulator was set up first, because he has that subject matter expertise. So it's to lean on those experts.
One of the problems I also have is that I believe the Office of Procurement Regulator was set up, that part of the law was proclaimed sometime late in 2015. Which meant that you had an entire board running, an entire agency running, and we're paying persons to do a job that they can't do because the law has yet not been proclaimed.
Yeah.
And I think that is that's where another issue lies, because we're paying all of this money every month for staff, for the regulators to do their work, but they don't have the scrutiny powers under the legislation, simply because the law is not yet in effect. And we have seen in Trinidad and Tobago that there have been issues of corruption. Trinidad and Tobago is no stranger to the rest of the world in terms of those issues relating to corruption. And it's really the future of our nation at stake, because, I'm still young, I'm probably the youngest one here, right? But I want to see a brighter future for myself and my children and my family. I want to ensure that when government gives out contracts or they construct something, that it leaves a legacy for the rest of the nation, the future of the nation. And these are particular pieces of legislation I think can really give that effect in terms of saying that as Trinidadians, we are proud to say that our government would have built this and people of Trinidad and Tobago got value for money, because more wastage there is in government, the less the benefit is to the citizen. And those are some of the issues that I have with the government delaying the full proclamation of this act. I think it's a very important piece of legislation. Several other countries have moved towards a similar system like this. I believe in Botswana, they have something very similar in terms of how they procure goods and services. Now, there's one other area I want to touch on. It does not relate to the 2020 amendment, but there's an earlier amendment that dealt with the disposal of state lands. Because as I said before, the Central Tenders Board does not deal with the disposal of state assets. Disposal of state assets mean that to the listening public, those goods and services that are owned by the government and would like to have them sold or the actual disposal. There's one particular amendment that was made whereby state lands, all lands owned by the government, will now be the disposal of those will now be done by regulation made by the Minister of Finance. That in itself can pose a problem, and that's also a negative resolution of Parliament, which means that the Parliament as a whole will not be able to discuss those regulations unless a motion is filed. What are your views, especially in light of the government's policy when it comes to divestment? Because we have seen what happened with the attempted sale of the refinery. We have heard of the port privatization, and also another big one is relating to the gas stations, which were all announced in the last budget. What are your views on those things, on those matters?
I believe that with regards to, it's not just state land, with regards to the disposal, it has to do with plant and equipment as well.
Yes.
Right? Because you would have mentioned petrochem, but I mean, even if you look at bodies like the police service, PTSC, derelict vehicles, right? We have acres and acres of vehicles that are just now rotting, doing nothing. These things can be disposed of properly and bringing revenue to the relevant agencies. Are we doing it? Are we managing it? The answer to that is no. At least I don't think so. Right? I would like to see that aspect of the legislation be a little more comprehensive, because when it is you're talking about disposal, I think it's a little wider than that. And also valuation, because again, we're going back to subjectivity.
Yeah.
Who is going to set the value, right? And what justification do we have for setting the value and where we set it? You know, these things need to be clear, right? And I think by eliminating that ambiguity, you're going to get more buy-in. That's where I stand on it.
The government needs to be mindful that when you start looking at legislation and you put it in such a concise manner, the interpretation is always a problem. And if you take this piece of legislation and you narrow it down to what they have been saying, then you will take Jason's point that what happens to Ministry of Works, what happens to the Ministry of National Security, what happens to all the assets all over the place? How do you dispose? And in some cases, it is disposed and nobody knows where it went or what is the price it went for. And that whole situation should be spelled out in a more concise manner. How even if you put that authority in the hands of the Minister of Finance or whoever, what are the guidelines that he should observe in order to dispose? And if it is not done equitable, again, it will always be unjust to the public.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And my issue with that is that the same person who wants to dispose is the same person making the law. right? That's where the problem lies, because
Yes.
if I want to dispose in a particular manner, well, then I simply make the regulations in this manner because
Yes.
I believe that is what it should be, and that's where we remove or kind of water down the powers of the office itself, the office of the procurement regulator.
Yeah, because I mean, right now, how states' assets are disposed of, like you said, doesn't fall under CTB. It actually falls under the Ministry of Finance. There's actually a department. I have a good couple of friends who used to work there in the past, and right now they're understaffed and overburdened with regards to the work there. And let's talk about any asset that the state has to dispose of, from chairs to computers to desks, office equipment, buildings, land, and you're specifically holding on land. And a good friend of mine always used to say, when we talk about procurement of buildings or government exercises in building big buildings, we always talk about the cost of the buildings, but we never talk about the cost of the land. To Jason's point, the valuation, and that's always the missing piece of the puzzle. And that's where, again, there needs to be oversight. Because the question becomes, because the office of the procurement regulator was appointed or has been appointed by the president, directly by the president. So it reports directly to Parliament, if I remember correctly, the way the approach structure. Right. So it avoids political interference in the appointment of the office, who is appointed, because the president is obviously independent, is the way they approach it. So because you have that independent body, so the question becomes, if you're now going to make amendments, which I never am in favor of making peaceful amendments, even when I worked in government and on laws, and you would know that being a legislator now, if you need to make amendments, there are substantial amendments, then you make a substantial, but doing peace now and peace later on, it creates questions. So then my question would be then, where's the oversight for the Minister of Finance in doing this thing? Because through negative resolution, you just put it on the order paper. If nothing happens in X amount of days, then it becomes regulation. So there needs to be, again, if the minister wants to give himself this power, personally, that's fine. But you need that oversight. Who is going to, the old saying we have in Trinidad, who's going to guard the guards, right? So where's that oversight coming in? That oversight needs to be an independent body, and that's where the OPR was initially set up. So if you're going to remove him, then I would like to know, where's the oversight?
All right. So I think we had a very good discussion. I just ask you all to just bring some closing remarks, and I just want to thank you all for being here. I mean, you all are patriots of Trinidad and Tobago. Everyone cares about our country. We want to see a better future for our nation. We have seen other countries around us growing, and we also want to grow larger than them. So with respect to this piece of legislation, the FOI Act, again, we need to ensure that there is some level of transparency, accountability, and good governance in Trinidad and Tobago, because that benefits the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago rather than benefits only the government. We have to look at the holistic, the bigger picture in this entire thing in terms of the benefit that this would trickle down to. And for the listening public, all three individuals who joined me today came here as independent voices, divorced from any partisan view or any other bias that they may have, and they came here in their capacity, and I thank them for joining this discussion, especially on such an important issue relating to the governance of our country. So to bring some closing remarks, I'll ask Jason if you can start.
All right. Just keeping in a bipartisan spirit, I really hope that that the discussion that we had here could have some impact on review, right? In terms of finding a more solid and comprehensive solution to the concerns that we've raised. And I really think we need to be more inclusive, and we need to have that principle of equity pushed forward in all the discussions that we have. And I guess when it is we have those discussions that way, right? It will find its way into the legislation, and that is what is important to benefit everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. Ms. Ali?
My view on something as important as procurement I think the government need to have more open dialogue with the public, because it is an interest in the public that whatever happens there, they want to see transparency, they want to feel good that they are included in whatever happens. And the government obviously has left so many loopholes in this piece of legislation that they did pass, and we are hoping that some amendments take place. If this is not done, then you have the entire country feeling a sense of disbelief in any piece of legislation coming to address their concern, but not really addressing it. So we need to really bring proper legislation that will address the concerns of the entire population.
Yeah, I'd like to echo the sentiments of both speakers. I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to have here is a discussion devoid of parties, because at the end of the day, whenever this act becomes law, it affects everybody, regardless of whichever affiliation you're with. Big business, small business, wherever you may be, whether if you're in the rural area, if in the urban area, it's going to affect everyone. So I think, it bodes well that we have seen that when this amendment came up, that several sectors of community, from NGOs to business sectors, have come out stating that, listen, we're not in total agreement with the stuff that you've said here or proposed here, and we need to have discussion. I think in the end of the day, the government should be government of the people, for the people, and by the people, and the government needs to listen to and engage in dialogue and consultation and stakeholder engagement with everyone. So at the end of the day, like you said, we have a piece of legislation that brings a sense of calm to anyone, that the procurement process is going to be scrutinized, and there's going to be a level of transparency and accountability.
And that's a good point, government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Because I could remember when this was for debate, that this bill merely made it through the Senate. Of the 9 independent senators, 8 of them did not vote for the bill. They got the vote of 1 independent senator, and that's how the bill was passed. So it shows that there's a very loud dissent in the country with respect to this particular amendment. And as Jason would have said, that it is because probably it's not clear enough, and there needs to be some more refining of the particular amendment that is being proposed. So again, colleagues, I'd just like to thank you all for joining the discussion, for trying to let us build a better TNT for all of us. So I thank you all for viewing, and there will be more sessions coming up from other colleagues in the Parliament with respect to the repeal of the Procurement Amendment 2020. Thank you very much.